Hi, welcome to this session of Connect with Google. Today we'll be preparing for a Google interview. My name is Luis, and I'm the Software Engineering Manager for the Google Arts frontend, for Google Arts and Culture frontend. Probably you have seen my work if you take a selfie in the last month and compare it to artworks. I have been here at Google for 11 years, and so far I have done around 315 interviews. And now let's go to Anna.
I've been here a lot less time. I interned twice, and then I started full-time on Android in January this year. I work on digital well-being, so those are features being launched soon, which basically include things like setting time limits on apps. So it locks you out after you've used 15 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever you set. Features like you can flip your phone over and it goes into Do Not Disturb to silence it if you're having a meal with your family or in a work meeting and your phone starts going off. And then our other features called Wind Down, and you set a schedule of when you want to sleep, and then your device goes into black and white and Do Not Disturb on that schedule to help you kind of detach when you do want to detach from your phone. So today we're going to talk about a few things for preparing for these interviews. So first we're going to discuss what we look for at Google, and then how to prepare for a technical interview. We're going to talk about some common mistakes to avoid that he's had experience actually seeing. Why practice makes perfect, and just the importance of just doing these questions with your friends. And then we're going to end with a QA. So if you have questions for us, add them to the chat, and we'll go through as many as we can at the end.
So, what do we look for in Google? I know that many of you are going to be applying for a software engineering internship or as a new graduate. So it's important that your resume tells the full story. At Google, we don't use cover letters, so your resume should cover all the points. Make sure to include your estimated graduation date, including the month and year, or if you have recently graduated, when you did. Include the education section at top. Include relevant coursework like data structures, algorithms, compilers, any interesting work that you have done at university. Also include work that you have done outside of university, such as computer science clubs, hackathons, internships, open source projects, or anything that may give us a better picture of who you are. Also, include what level of code proficiency you have in each language that you have. Make sure to include extracurriculars, anything that can help us understand better who you are. Make sure to include also your minimum and preferred qualifications that we are looking for. And if you are actually applying as a university graduate, we are looking for industry-level coding proficiency. We are also looking more at the advanced projects and classes and developer experience that you have already gained. And again, make sure to include either when you're going to graduate or if you have recently graduated, when it happened. What are we going to be looking for in an interview? We'll be evaluating your knowledge of data structures and algorithms, how you use them, how you use those to solve problems, and how you analyze the problems, your analytical skills, how well you understand code, the code that you have written, how can you review the code that you have written, and what level of communication you have. The thing that you will not be seeing are brain teasers. We really don't need to know why a manhole cover is round.
So now we're going to move on to how to prepare for a tech interview. So first, I think, and this is kind of the core thing that everything else is built on, is studying the basics. So you should go over essentially what language you're most familiar with, whether it's Java, C++, Python, Go. And once you've determined the language you want to do your interview in, you then want to kind of learn the algorithms, data structures for that language. General just structure of code, so kind of what is a method, what is a class, anything that feels far away, you should definitely review. There's some basic algorithms that your interviewer might expect you to have familiarity with or knowledge of, things like sorting algorithms or search algorithms, like bubble sort, binary search, the trade-offs between these, which is typically in terms of memory, or big O analysis, which is essentially runtime, so how fast the algorithm actually runs. And you also might be asked about big O analysis of your algorithm that you write. So just having a general idea of big O is a good thing to know for after you solve the problem. Recursion, so this is essentially something that you'll study in your classes where something triggers itself over and over until the solution's found. And then there are sometimes problems with graphs where you'll want familiarity using those. Then whichever language you're using, you'll want to really study the data structures of it. So the trade-offs between them, as most problems can be solved with different data structures, and your choice of them, you kind of want to explain to your interviewers so they also agree that it's a good data structure to use. So between lists and sets, that list can have an item multiple times, whereas sets can only have it once. Stacks, queues, trees, graphs, hashing, and maps, and then as well as heaps.
So once you're in an interview, what do we evaluate? The first thing we evaluate is how the candidate analyzes a problem. If the candidate went through the problem methodically and logically, and if they found special cases or edge cases that have to be covered, like an empty array, or having a null pointer, or similar edge cases. We are looking for a strong foundation in computer science and computer science concepts. If the candidate can produce working code, we look at the syntax, but we don't really look if you have dot every I and every semicolon is in place. Don't worry about that. We are looking if the candidate tested the code, which test cases the candidate used, if the code is clean and is simple to read and to maintain, if the candidate can explain their ideas easily, not just in the code, but in the design that they write before, if the candidate is pleasant to work with, if it's a nice conversation, if it's easy to get along. We understand that this interview is a stressful situation, but still we are looking for people that we are going to be working every day. So that's an important factor.
So another huge thing in interviews is your communication and presentation. So verbalizing your thoughts in interviews is so important and something that's very different than the coding you're going to have done in university or for classes, where you can just go off, find a solution, and then get graded separately on that. The point of Google giving you an interviewer is so that you can actually interact and they can hear you verbalize your thoughts rather than us just watching a recording or just having you off on your own. So when your interviewer gives you the question, make sure you restate the question, how you're understanding it, just so you know you're actually on the same page. You're not solving something that's much harder or maybe even much easier than your interviewer expects you to solve. Ask any clarifying questions you have. Your interviewer is actually curious about the questions you're going to ask and seeing how you think towards a solution. If you instantly had a solution to the problem, there would be no point to the interview, because typically interview questions are things you can solve, but the goal is seeing how you'll think about larger problems in the future, not that you can just solve this single problem. So you need to actually show your thought process towards that solution. Think out loud. So if you can't think while speaking, that's totally fine, but think for a few seconds and then after say, here's what I was thinking about, explain to your interviewer so they're on the same page as you of, I'm thinking about this edge case, or I'm thinking about the general pseudocode of this, whatever it is. Draw pictures to help visualize your solutions. So if you are in an in-person interview, which means you're using a whiteboard, you can draw it out on the whiteboard. If you're on a phone interview and you're on a Google Doc, you can draw something out yourself and explain it, or just try to explain it to your interviewer if you'd prefer. And then, as I said before, if you do need to think in silence, that's totally fine. Just don't end thinking in silence and start coding, because your interviewer has no idea what you just thought about, and you might be coding something that's down a rabbit hole, and there's no way for them to kind of stop you or gauge where you're at. Then listen to your interviewer. So your interviewer is there because they want you to succeed. They want to see how you're thinking. So view this as more of a discussion with them as they're trying to guide you towards a solution, and hear how you're thinking towards that. See if they're providing any sort of hints. If you do have multiple solutions, you can say, I'm thinking about this versus this. I know this has better runtime, or I don't really know what the trade-offs are. Like, whatever it is, they will talk with it. They might say, oh, well, think about the case where it's null. And then you could maybe see that one algorithm's better. If you start with the edge cases as well, you could just immediately ask them what happens if it's null, what happens if there's no solution to this problem, things like that, that help them realize you really are planning for the future of this. Then practice is so important. So once you have kind of the basic knowledge and you've practiced communicating, unless you actually practice doing these, when you get stressed and are in it, it's a very different situation. So you want to either find friends or even by yourself, just get a whiteboard and go through a question. So once you've chosen your strongest coding language, only practice in that so you don't kind of mess up the syntax things. Those won't actually make or break an interview at all, but it will just make you feel more comfortable. But again, as Lee said, you're not expected to write code that's going to perfectly compile. Whatever the method's going to be, practice with that. So if it's a phone interview, just open a blank Google Doc and try coding on that. And if it's an in-person interview, see if you can find somewhere with a whiteboard, or just in general, put a piece of paper on the wall if you don't have a whiteboard, just so you practice the fact that you can't just like you can in IDE, delete a bunch of things, move things around. It's very different structure than normal coding. Then to actually get these coding problems, you can look on coding websites for different things to practice. I used Cracking the Coding Interview, has a lot of problems in different languages. And then if you need any accommodations, let your recruiter know and they'll make sure that in the actual interview they're handled.
So, it's easy to get to the interview and make some very common mistakes. So let's just try to see which are the most common ones. The first one is jumping into code. Please don't do this. Just write a design, just a small graph, a pseudocode outline of the function, but really just don't jump straight into the code. The problem, as Anna said, is that if you jump into the code directly, we don't know what you're thinking. You may be going into the wrong direction, and we only recognize that too late, and we cannot evaluate or give you a hint that take a different direction. Also, it may be much harder for the interviewer to understand what you are doing if you just jump into the code without any introduction. And then, if you just jump into the code, the interviewer will not be able to offer hints. So it's better if you can just write a small design first, like just a couple of blocks or a couple of lines of pseudocode to explain what you're going to do. Another very common mistake is just to avoid testing. We don't mean that you have to write full test cases and the full syntax of the test cases, just a couple of examples that illustrate how your code will work. Remember, sometimes mention the edge cases, but in general, pick a simple example, just a few values, and run them through the code. Then it will be able to identify problems, identify omissions, or things that don't go as planned. It's very, very easy to think the code works in one way, but when the code runs, it actually does something else. Your interviewer, unfortunately, only can see the code that you have written and not the code that you think you have written. So please run the code with examples and not just in your head, but with the code that you have written. Another very common mistake is not writing real code. Pseudocode is fine for introducing the solution, but we want to see real code because there are many mistakes that can only be seen, or many problems that can only be seen when you write the real code. In pseudocode, it's super easy to gloss over problems like off by one indexes, or just skipping a step, or things like that that are probably much more delicate in real code. And seeing the real code allows us to evaluate better how you work, what is your knowledge, and actually see how you react to having written real code. So pseudocode is fine for the initial solution, but not for the final complete code. It's fine if you write code and you leave a couple of helper functions unimplemented. Just tell your interviewer, well, this function should do this. Do you want me to implement or not? Sometimes these functions are just boilerplate that are so simple to implement that it's not really worth spending time. That's actually a very, very common mistake because, well, it's easier to think in pseudocode. And finally, avoid any premature optimization. Think about the basic algorithm that you are trying to implement and how complex it is. Sometimes it's fine to start with a brute force solution and implement it and optimize it later. Tell your recruiter that you acknowledge that this is just brute force, but you can always optimize later. Your interviewer will actually tell you, oh, yeah, just write the brute force solution, or, okay, the brute force solution is too simple, let's try to optimize here and there a bit more. Just verbalize it first, and then just talk with your interviewer.
So now we're going to do a chance to practice. So we're not going to do a full technical interview, but we're just going to kind of go through an example question and then how we would kind of think about it, the questions we'd ask. So an example question you could get as a SWE would be sort an array of numbers. And so that for its sorted version, the following wiggly inequalities apply. where the first value is less than or equal to the second value, which is greater than or equal to the next, which is then again less than or equal to the one after. So after seeing this problem, you would kind of first just maybe restart the question, say, okay, so I have this array and I'm going to sort it, but I'm not just going to sort it smallest to greatest or greatest to smallest. Then you could ask your interviewer some clarifying questions. So you could say, is the array I'm given sorted? And they'll tell you yes or no, because that could make this problem a lot easier. If you know it's sorted, then you know kind of that the next value is always greater than the one before. You could start thinking about edge cases. So as Louis said before, can I assume that the array is not null? And if they say, no, assume that it could be null, then you need to have some sort of handling of that case. You can say in this case, I think could there be not a solution? I think there could always be a solution.
Or there could be multiple solutions sometimes.
Yes, you could say, is any solution that passes valid, or is there an optimal solution? So optimizations as well. So essentially, if you have a brute force 1 versus O, if it's sorted, I can run through this only once. You can say that as well to the interviewer. But also it could be that you just have a solution you want to do, and then at the end you say, let's discuss possible optimizations, things like that. Then I would kind of think of a simple example of this, just because the placeholder values make it kind of harder to think about. So coming up with an example array of 6, 4, 2, and then seeing, okay, what's a valid solution to this? 4 is less than 6, 6 is greater than 2. So that would be kind of an easy case I could run through my code after to test and make sure it works. And then if that does maybe one larger case, and then if I still haven't found any issues, then it could be done. Or if there's another edge case, your interviewer will probably kind of say, you should probably test your code more, something along those lines. And then you can start describing your solution or saying, can I write pseudocode? But before you just start coding a solution, asking your interviewer, does it sound like I'm ready to code now? So then here's the actual answer to this question, which both Luis and I laughed when we got to this slide in practice, because your code will never look like this in an interview. Regardless of if you're doing a whiteboard or a Google Doc. If you're in a whiteboard, you're probably going to have a lot of more space between these lines and arrows. It's a lot harder to move things around as you think about them and come up with cases, and that's expected and part of whiteboard coding. If you're in a Google Doc, it could look a little closer, but again, the formatting's not going to be the same, and it's not expected to be code that could be run right now. So the syntax and little things like that, we know that compilers give you hints and turn things red, and if you miss a semicolon, notice, things like that. So essentially, this function takes an array of items, and then it gives the counts, basically how many things are in this array we're sorting. The interviewee is using up as a value to basically say, should this item be greater than or should it be less than the next item, but this could be a Boolean, this could be different things. And then they're using a for loop and going through everything in the list. And then if the up value is basically saying that the current one should be greater, they're checking that the current item is greater than the next item. And then if the up value should be less than, they're checking that the current item is less than the next one. Then they're using a temporary value to essentially switch these items. And then using this temporary value is super important, or your array would kind of replace it with the next thing. And so this would be something that running through an example test case could catch if you didn't know to use this temporary value before just switching items in the array.
So when you are writing your solution, don't really worry about the small typos. You are going to miss an S, you are going to write item instead of items, that's fine. It's very easy to just make a typo when you're not really writing in an IDE and you're not compiling. Try to get the details right. Try to make sure that the swap code actually works, that you realize that you are assigning temp in one place instead of a real item. Just try to get the details right, but don't sweat about the typos. Write legibly. That's why you need to practice writing in a whiteboard. Leave extra room, because you will forget a line here or there, and then you just have the space to add it. Use arrows if you have forgotten a block of code. That's perfectly fine. Your code is never going to be as clean as the code that you have seen here. That's perfectly fine. An interview is messy. It's fine. We understand that. Nobody gets punished because, oh, I forgot this block of code. I add it now. Make sure to use helper functions to simplify the code, to make sure that you can skip a part of the code that is tedious. Helper functions are really useful in an interview situation, and you may not even have to write the actual implementation. Be conscious of the time. Your interview will last approximately 45 minutes, which sounds pretty long, but actually time flies in an interview. And again, don't freeze. It's not one strike and you're out. You are allowed to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes during an interview. Also, unfortunately, you have to practice. Practice with the whiteboard, practice with an empty Google Doc. Really, it's very, very different writing code for university with a compiler versus writing in an interview code in a whiteboard or writing it in a Google Doc that is empty and doesn't report any errors. If you are not sure something was understood, just err on the side of the over-communicating. Repeat it in a different way. Ask the interviewer if they understood what you meant. Just make sure that you communicate your ideas clearly. Test your code. Test the code that you have written, not the code that you have thought about, not the code that you think you have written, the code that is actually on the whiteboard. And finally, don't panic. The interview is stressful. We know that. We understand that. So we are fine if you are a bit nervous during the interview, and we are going to try to make you feel calm and comfortable. So we understand that when you come for an interview, you are going to be interviewing in other companies. We are perfectly fine with that. We understand. And we are going to try to make it as simple for you to get the best opportunity you can. So we know that there are deadlines for other offers, or the other companies have deadlines for you to reply. Please let us know. Let your recruiter know. You will not be penalized because you are interviewing with a different company. The recruiter will try to hurry up things if they are needed. Let the recruiter in the other company know that you are also interviewing with Google. Every recruiter will make time. They will try to stretch deadlines. They will actually extend the time that for any offer if they really, really need it. Just talk with your recruiters. They are there to help. And finally, please, if you accept an offer in another company, let us know. That's fine. We are very happy that you got an offer that you are happy with. Just let us know, because ethically we cannot proceed once you have received an offer. Sorry, once you have accepted an offer. Make sure to tell your recruiter exactly in which position you are. It's going to make everybody's life much simpler.
So now on how to actually apply. So there's google.com/students, and you can look through the roles available there and look for your qualifications and see which things match and apply there. To actually apply, you upload your resume or CV and your transcript of the classes you've taken. An unofficial version of the transcript is totally fine. And then you just submit. It's actually a pretty easy, straightforward process. And we're hiring soon, so these applications actually open very soon in October. So if you're applying for STEP, it opens on the 15th of October. This is if you're in your first or second year of university, and closes on December 7th. If you're applying as a software engineering intern, this opens on the 1st of October at the same time as PhD research interns open. And then the deadline for software engineering, sooner, so that's November 24th. And then for PhD research, it's January 18th. But I would say for any of these positions, when they open in October, if you're planning to apply, it can only help to apply sooner when they haven't really filled any of these yet. So that's all we have prepared for today on interview tips, but we're excited to take your questions, and please keep adding them to the live chat so we can go through the questions you guys have for us.
So we already have the first two questions. Yuho asks, what would you suggest the balance between learning the ins and outs of various data structures and algorithms should be versus doing many interview questions from sites like HackerRank or LeetCode versus doing many mock interviews, and whether we had a scheduled routine before we were preparing for the interview?
So I guess I went through this more recently since I just joined full-time. So the balance time-wise for me was more that I viewed learning the data structures algorithms as the prerequisite to doing mock interviews. If you start practicing mock interviews and you don't actually know the data structures in the language, it's really hard to actually be practicing finding good solutions to these. So I would kind of get some book or review your old textbooks and go through kind of the basics of the language. If you already have experience using these because you're using that same language in your class, you might not need to do this, but I did my interviews in Java, and I'd last taken Java in high school. I was mainly doing C++, so because of that, I really did review this quite a lot before I started doing mock interviews, but I think it depends your comfortability.
Exactly. So before I joined Google, I have been in the industry for around 6 years. This was my fourth job. So I have done already quite a few interviews. So I focus more on data structures and algorithms, which I had studied a long time before I applied for Google. But again, a lot depends on your experience. If you have already done a lot of interviews, maybe you want to practice more the how to write in a whiteboard, or you may want to practice more your data structures and algorithms. You can always tweak. I would say in general, I would prepare a third, and a third if you have not done any interviews, just to make sure that all the bases are covered. And well, since my routine was slightly different, the one thing I did was really relax before the interview. The day before, I just didn't do anything. I just relaxed a bit, took a walk, just very, very calm, to make sure I was confident, I was calm during the interview. It's just like before an exam, there is a point where it doesn't make sense to prepare anymore. So I just relaxed and was very, very comfortable during the interview.
Yeah, I think it's really good to have some sort of routine. So for my interviews for full-time, I was interning at that point. So the other interns and I would get together and every week do mock interviews. And it's really helpful to have this because then it makes sure you're not cramming everything right at the end and really stressed out. You have this kind of regular practice. And then it's also really helpful because you actually get to, in watching other people do their mock interviews, it's helping them, but it really does help yourself of when someone just starts coding and you have no idea what's happening, you realize, okay, I need to make sure that I'm communicating before I just start coding. You start to see these common mistakes we were talking about. And then it's also just clear when the person loses you or when someone goes silent that you really don't know what they're thinking. Even if you're doing the problem with them and you have the answer, you don't really know where they are in finding that unless they're communicating to you. So we have a question from Diana. So she says, what should someone do if an interviewer still asks a brain teaser or a problem in a field one's never worked in or has basic knowledge about, like networking?
I will, normally in these cases it would be probably more of an introductory question, more of understanding where you are, and then the interviewer will continue giving you hints and trying to elicit knowledge out of you. It will be very unusual that a brain teaser is asked, but mostly this is just for a kickoff. Then it will give a set of logical steps to go on, and if it's an area that you only have a basic knowledge, that's perfectly fine. We know that if you're applying for Google, it's not because you know everything, but it's because you know how to solve problems. So in these cases, we will be evaluating how you do the logical steps. In these cases, we are not looking for a solution. It will be perfectly fine if you find a solution that is completely wrong, but the steps that took you to that solution were very logical and very well thought of. We understand nobody knows everything about everything. So it's fine. We normally try to dig very deep into the questions, and we are always going to reach a point where you don't know the answer. And how you elaborate on that situation, how you postulate possible solutions or possible assumptions on the answer is very valuable knowledge. And well, that's actually also what happens in real life. Once you're working at Google, you will always be working at the cutting edge of things, where things are unexplored, where things are really, really advanced, and nobody has an answer for them. So how you do the logical steps, that's a very valuable skill at Google. And yeah, you will make mistakes when you're such really on the forefront of technology, and that's fine. That's part of the process, and that's a part of the interview process. So don't worry if you don't know an area. The interviewer actually knows that you don't know everything.
Yeah. So next we have Sehar asks, will a year in the industry, computer science related, be worth it? I'm not sure if this is in terms of as preparing for an interview or just in general, but I think I've been at Google full-time for 9 months now, and it's been so amazing, such a whirlwind. I really loved my 3-month internships because it exposed me to new teams and new locations. but being on something full-time and really getting to see, essentially my project started in January and we're launching next month, so seeing something from its creation to launch has been so cool and just an unreal experience that was very different from university, where you're more kind of gaining the knowledge to be able to do what I'm doing now, but I'm not actually producing something that I'm launching to the world.
It may sound a bit self-aggrandizing, but a positive point of being in the industry before is you realize how good Google is. Coming from different companies, you realize like how things work, how well things work within Google, how everybody is very, very collaborative within Google. But still, we are recruiting a lot from people who have just graduated, don't have experience in the industry beyond internships. And we actually calibrate for that. We understand that if you have never worked, your experience is different from other engineers who have worked before in the industry. And this variability is super useful. The diversity in Google encourages us to create products and services that encompass everyone. So we are looking for every different kind of experience, every different role. We are looking for people who have tons of years in the industry. We're looking for recent graduates, and they all contribute differently for the success of the product, the success of the project. And yeah, I think it's interesting if you have experience, but it's also interesting if you don't have experience. So Letty asks, will there be any questions about the programming language we will be using in the interview? I can answer this one actually, because sometimes I do ask questions about the programming language, but it's not so much about how much you know about the programming language, but how much you can deduce and how much you can understand how the computer science concept behind the language. For instance, whenever I do an interview in C++, I always go deep into how you pass values, if they are, how the parameters are passed by value or by reference, not because I am really want to know, oh, do you know specifically what is the syntax in C++ to pass a value by reference? I really don't care about that. I care about understanding well how memory works, how memory is copied, when memory is copied, when memory is not copied, and the underlying computer science concept behind the language and the language feature.
Yeah, I think that it's just, if you're asked questions about the language, it's because the interviewer is trying to understand how you think in some way, and there's something about the language that's tricky. In C++, it's memory. But in kind of all languages, they have their trade-offs. And so if you're getting specific questions on it, it should be something you've studied of. In C++, you do study pointers and memory allocation a lot. So it probably won't be an in-depth study of how the language was implemented, but the things that will actually come up as an engineer in that language.
Yeah. What I will never ask is, oh, do you know what is the syntax for overriding an operator? Mostly because even if I ask, I wouldn't know if it's correct or not. That syntax is really complex, and it's something that you can look in a book. But understanding when overriding an operator is useful or when it's not, when it's more confusing than not, that's actually a really interesting and very valuable idea when you are working.
So now we have from Theodore in the interview, if I verbalize my idea but I don't finish writing all the code, will my chances be reduced substantially?
A lot depends on the question. I sometimes have some questions that I know that are pretty long, and it's fine. I normally tell, well, I know this question is long. Let's focus on this area of the question, and let's leave the rest if we have time. And sometimes, as you say, verbalizing your idea is useful. We understand that you have a solution for the full problem, but a lot of the problem may be just writing boilerplate code that doesn't add any value for the interview. And so we may even ask you, don't write this code. It's going to waste our time. Just don't worry about that part. The interviewer will actually tell you pretty solidly, OK, which areas are more important in the question, which areas we should explore more. Sometimes I may prefer just to leave some code unimplemented to go to a different question. So yeah, it's not a big deal if you don't finish writing all the code when the question is really large. What do you think?
I think similar. I think the helper functions you were talking about earlier, where you don't have to actually implement them, if you do get something where it's just the sheer amount of code is a lot, but you've already kind of described how you think about it, kind of trying to put as many things as you can into helper functions of, okay, this would sort all the values for me, and then you say, do you want me to actually do this? This would get the maximum value, and things that they might not be as worried about if you can do, and then just trying to have that you get all the pieces together, whereas other problems are going to be that they want all the code and it's less code, so you can write in 45 minutes, but it really depends on the interviewer, on the question, and they will try to guide you towards what they're looking for, and they'll be calibrated on this question. So they will have expectations for, how do other people answer this? They probably tried to answer the question themselves and seen how long it takes and things like that.
Yeah. And of course, we know that some languages you are going to be writing more code. I have a question that I know that can be finished in Python, but I know that in C++ it's impossible to finish in 45 minutes. And that's fine. I understand I have different expectations depending on the language, and I'm calibrated against that because I have asked this question many times. I solved it myself several times in the different languages just to see the different alternatives. The interviewer really knows their questions really well, and they are very calibrated, so don't worry too much if you don't finish writing all the code for a long question. Agnieszka asks, can I apply for all positions? Well, make sure that you only apply for those that you are eligible, I think.
Yeah, so if you look through the qualifications and see if you're in your first or second year, then you're eligible for STEP, but if you're a PhD student, I would not recommend applying for that just because it's going to be more noise for the recruiter. They do want to actually have people apply who are matched to the positions. If you're unsure if you meet the expectations in terms of the amount of coding classes and things you've taken, but you're in the correct year frame, I think you can still apply, but just don't apply for things that you don't meet the actual requirements for.
Cyprian asks, are you judging a candidate also based on his 5-minute introduction from the beginning of an interview, or based on his questions from you from the ending part of an interview? Well, normally in the 5 minutes of introduction is more an introduction of myself than...
Yeah, I think also that it's not really that you're being judged on anything. All of it is they're just trying to learn about who you are, how you would fit in at Google, and how you're thinking about things. And that's kind of the full 45 minutes. So there's not a certain point where it's just, yeah, you could say anything and it's going to be ignored. The whole time they're going to be saying, would I want this person on my team? Do I think this person's thinking about things in a way that would lead to a good solution? Things like that. You will probably have your interviewer introduce themselves. You will probably introduce yourself as well. But your actual resume and CV that the recruiters read is less the focus of the interview. It's not just explain that to your interviewer. They're more interested in how you solve this problem. They might ask you about your CV, but that's not typically the focus of the 45 minutes.
Yeah. And also, you're going to have more than one interview. If you are applying for an internship, you have at least 2 phone screens. If you're applying for a full-time position, you have on-site interviews. And each individual interviewer asks a different question. They don't communicate between themselves, except for coordinating that they don't ask the same question twice. But besides that, they don't tell each other the results of their interviews. It's completely independent. So don't worry too much if you think one interview didn't go well. Also, your perception, it may seem like some of the interviewers are very, very silent, and that's because they are thinking, not because they are disagreeing with what you are doing. Conducting an interview is a hard process. It requires a lot of concentration. So don't overread what the interviewer is saying, doing, or not doing. Just remain calm and focus on the code that you are going to write, on the design that you are doing, on how you explain your code. And probably that's really the core part of the interview.
Yeah. So then we have Diana asks, if the interview exceeds 45 minutes with more than 15 minutes, and the interviewer seems okay with that, should I say something about that? I think this would be kind of rare. I think most interviews are scheduled, and then typically at 45 minutes, wherever you're at, the interviewer will try to wrap up, but this is more in your interviewer's hands. So if they have given you a really long problem and they still think you're on your way, I think I would just go with it, but I doubt this will happen.
Yeah, the interviewer probably also knows that there are other interviewers coming afterwards, so the interviewer will try to avoid delaying these other interviews. It will be very, very unusual that it exceeds the interview by such a long time. I mean, it's not 1 or 2 minutes that are like, just finishing a couple of sentences. 15 minutes would be very unusual.
Yeah.
So we are running out of time now. We really enjoyed doing this session, and thank you for joining. The next session, the next YouTube live session of Connect with Google is happening in November, so please join again. So thank you and bye.
Bye.